Welcome back to the Vandy Sports Podcast. This is Brandon Bigsby. My name is Elena Morris, and we're here to talk about Vanderbilt's conference schedule being released. We know who they're opening up with, who they're finishing with, and then we're also going to share with you guys at the end our predictions on how we think the SEC is going to pan out. But before we get started, we do want to let you all know we are looking for a sponsor for this upcoming season for all of our women's basketball content. So if you guys are interested or know anybody who would be interested in sponsoring all of our content, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'll also be putting my handle in the comments below. But let's kick it off, Brandon. The conference schedule has been announced for Vanderbilt. They're opening up on January the 2nd with the Georgia Bulldogs. Personally, I really like that opening matchup. I think it's going to be a good, nice little test for Vanderbilt to get started with.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And especially considering that to end the non-conference slate, you have two teams that are a little bit lower on the overall scale of things. So a nice little tune-up before you get to that Georgia game. I like, too, that you have that game starting out at home as well. So you end with two games in the non-conference at home, and you kick off the new year on January 2nd with that game against Georgia at home as well. And, obviously Georgia, not a slouch by any stretch. The SEC, such a deep team, and most other conferences, they probably would be getting a little bit more due than what they probably are right now. But I think for Vanderbilt, should feel relatively confident going into that game, considering all the talent that they're bringing back from last year.
Commodores went 2-0 against the Bulldogs last year, and if you remember, that was quite an iconic game in Memorial. Jordan Cambridge hitting her 1,000 points and breaking the steals record on Senior Day. So Commodores handling the Bulldogs well last season, but they're moving on to Kentucky, and this is an exciting one. And for me, at least, I'm looking forward to watching this matchup as Kentucky's going to look a lot different. Kenny Brooks coming over from Virginia Tech to lead on the Wildcats. Star point guard Georgia Amore going to lead them over there in Lexington. They'll actually be traveling to Memorial, though, for that game right after Georgia. So Kentucky, one of those better teams in the SEC. Not that there's, any bad team by any means, but the Wildcats really going to look for a turnaround season after parting ways with LZ. But I think that that's going to be a fun one to watch as well.
Yeah, and that's going to be really cool to see Vanderbilt get their first true SEC test against Kentucky of all teams, because like you said, just so many changes happening with Kentucky, a lot of hype around that team with the new head coach in Kenny Brooks, a lot of the transfers they brought in that are high impact players. This is a Kentucky team that, come January 5th, that could be a team that's easily ranked in the top 20 with the way that their roster is lined up and the way their schedule is lined up. Who knows, if Vanderbilt gets a couple of those wins against teams like Michigan State, Miami, that could very well be a top 25 matchup come early January. There's a possibility of that happening. So for that matchup to be that early on the season, I like, and I, again, really like that they have that game at home at Memorial Gymnasium. Students will probably just start to be coming back around then. So I think that if these two teams are in a good position, especially the Commodores, that could be a game with a lot of hype around it, and rightfully so.
Most definitely. Kentucky, definitely a different look. Maddie Shear, Asia Petty transferring out, but Kenny Brooks definitely reloaded up whenever he was moving over to Lexington. 2 back-to-back road games after that. These are 2 very well-respected coaches, Coach Yo, Coach Malky. Commodores will travel to Ole Miss, and then LSU. Talk about 2 tough road games back-to-back.
Yeah, I think Ole Miss has been one of the more underappreciated programs, arguably, in the SEC. Coach Yo, she has built a really strong foundation over there at Ole Miss. And it's kind of funny because, again, the SEC, such a strong team. You're talking about Ole Miss being a team that might be on the lower end of the top 10, arguably, coming into this year in the preseason. But they have so much talent that in most of their conferences, they would easily be a top 5 team in their conference without any doubt at all. And then, as you mentioned, anytime you're going up against a Kim Mulkey team, it's going to be a challenge. Her team's always so well coached. They're always going to have talent. I'm going to see Flau'jae Johnson, obviously, which is going to always be fun. So Vanderbilt, that's really where you start to see a lot of these tough matchups. Kentucky, Ole Miss, and LSU back-to-back, especially having those Kentucky and LSU games on the road early.
Definitely. Ole Miss, a little bit of a different look for them. Star player Markeisha Davis getting drafted by the Liberties, so they're going to have to find a new focal point. But Flau'jae Johnson, as you mentioned, going to be sort of the star at LSU now that Angel Reese has moved on to the WNBA. But 2 very tough teams, as you mentioned. Anytime you play Coach Yo or Coach Malky, that's going to be a battle-tested game. But they'll head back at home for a game that I think that Shea Ralph has circled on the calendar. Tennessee Lady Vols will make their way to Memorial under a new head coach this year, Kim Caldwell, getting hired 1 year out of Marshall. The Lady Vols picked up their new head coach, and that's going to be an interesting one. And that's actually a back-to-back weekend. The men's team will play the day before against Tennessee. So a lot of buzz going to be going on in Memorial that weekend, but the Lady Vols in late January making their way to Nashville.
Yeah, and that's going to be a lot of fun to see that Kim Caldwell offense. She was known for that really fast-paced, high-flying offense at Marshall, and it's going to be interesting to see Shea Ralph prepare her team for that because that style is so different from any other team in the SEC. And that game is one that means a lot. We saw that Vanderbilt, the 2 times they played Tennessee last year, fell just a little bit short. It felt like they were on their level, but just a few different stretches throughout those games, especially that first meeting in Knoxville, really did make the difference. You know that's going to be one they have circled on their calendar. Shea Ralph has said it in the past. I hate Tennessee. You have to remember, she played at UConn, that UConn-Tennessee rivalry, transfers perfectly over to Vanderbilt. It's yet to beat Tennessee so far in her career. You know that team has been itching to have that game. It is at Memorial Gym, as you mentioned. I think that's one that really could be one that they're looking forward to, arguably the most on the schedule.
That's a coin toss for me too. I mean, you saw how close they got in Knoxville last year. Vanderbilt actually led the majority of that game back and forth. And, Tennessee is very different. They were able to maintain keeping star player in Joel Spear, but other than that, no Tamara Key, no Rakia Jackson. A lot of pieces have moved on, but it's a whole new look. No more Kelly Harper. It's Kim Caldwell at the head of it all. So definitely a different look for the Lady Vols. That'll be an interesting game. As you mentioned, Shea Ralph has yet to beat Tennessee. And so I think that with the way that she's constructed her roster this year, she's probably giving herself the best chance to that she's had since leading Vanderbilt. And then another home game right after that, Arkansas, another huge team that has had some huge losses over the offseason. They're going to be looking different. That's a team that's going to be towards the bottom of the SEC in a game that Vanderbilt should be able to win after coming off of Tennessee. With that being more probably of a closer game.
Yeah, and I think that game could be viewed at in one of 2 ways, depending on how that Tennessee game goes. If they come off of a loss against Tennessee, it could be viewed as a get-back game, or if they come off of a win, could be viewed as a trap game in the middle of a Thursday at home. You kind of walk in after a huge rivalry win potentially. That Arkansas team, a team that, as you mentioned, has lost a lot of talent, but again, no team is a slouch in the SEC. It doesn't matter if you're ranked first. It doesn't matter if you're ranked 16th. Any team can come into your building and beat you any night. Shea Ralph knows that better than anybody. Her team knows that better than anybody. I think that these are those stretches right in the middle of this conference season where the depth and the experience of Vanderbilt and just the coaching staff and what they've been able to do with the program over the last year really will show itself with games like this.
And I'm just gonna stop really quick. You mentioned the word experience. That just stuck out immediately. I was watching Coach Ralph yesterday on SEC Now, and they were talking to her about the experience that her team is coming into this year with. They didn't really have that last year. They had Jordan Cambridge, but she was coming off an injury. Ayanna Moore coming off an injury. This team this year is very experienced, and that's going to carry them a long way. But after those 2 home games, they'll hit the road once again. Probably a little bit easier to go away after playing at LSU and Ole Miss, but still can't take a night off in the SEC. They'll head down to Tuscaloosa to take on Alabama and then make their way over to Florida to take on the Gators.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in these 2 games. Alabama, a team that has a good amount of hype around them coming into the season, could very well be ranked in the top 25, is definitely in the conversation heading into November. And then that Florida game is going to be very interesting on the road. And remember, the last time they saw the Gators was in the SEC tournament. That's a game a lot of people thought Vanderbilt should have won. Fell in that game, put them in a bit of a riskier situation come Selection Sunday. We're still able to get themselves in, but again, you keep saying it, any team can beat you on any night in the SEC. Vanderbilt saw that firsthand. I feel like kind of similar to Tennessee, that's a game they're going to have scheduled and circled on because that Florida team snuck up on them last year. I think they're going to have a point to prove in that one, especially going on the road in Gainesville as well.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that SEC tournament left a bit of a bitter taste in Vanderbilt's mouth. They'll come home for 1 home game and then hit the road again. It's going to be Ole Miss, the one team that they played twice this year with the new teams being added, Texas and Oklahoma. Vanderbilt sees every team once and sees one team twice. That's the Rebels this year. So Coach Yo will travel to Memorial. And so I think that'll be an interesting contest because of the fact that they had already seen them once at this point. But Vanderbilt a little bit the upper hand there, hosting them at Memorial.
Yeah, and so much time really separated between those games too. The game at Ole Miss, January 9th, the game at Memorial, February 2nd. So you're talking about 5 or 6 games that will be played between the first game and the second game. So it's going to be interesting to see how different these teams look and how more fine-tuned they are in terms of how locked in they are rotationally. If we see some of that consistency, and this is typically where you see players start to hit their stride as well, is come February. You're starting to kind of get SEC tournament, March Madness play on your mind a little bit. This could be a game where it's going to be a lot of fun because these two teams will be in similar spot in the standings. At least I would assume so. We'll see maybe what we think about that a little bit later. But, that's going to be a fun one to watch, especially as you mentioned, since they are the only team that Vandy will see twice.
This next one is going to be a fun one. A new opponent to the SEC. Vanderbilt will hit the road and go to Texas. The Longhorns, who've made their way over from the Big 12, that is a powerhouse. They have been recently, at least. Rory Harmon and the Longhorns will host Vanderbilt for the first time since joining the conference. I'm excited to take a look at the Longhorns.
Yeah, I am too. And I think Texas is a team that could very well end up being a team that could win the SEC in their first year. They have so much talent across the board. Were one of the best teams in the Big 12 just last season. And it was a conference that was pretty good. A lot of the attention went to the SEC and the Pac-12, but the Big 12 had some really high quality teams with Texas, with Oklahoma, West Virginia, a team that was ranked throughout a lot of the years. So Texas coming into a battle-tested SEC squad, but nevertheless, seeing Vanderbilt match up against them, let alone in Austin, going to be an interesting test, especially if Vanderbilt comes in on their game. Again, an experienced team that has really learned how to win over the last few years. Might not be a game where people look at and they say, oh, yeah, that should be a win. But I think Vanderbilt has the talent to compete with this Texas team. And though it might be a tough victory, could very well find their way to it.
And even if, they don't come out on the right side of that game, just being able to get the experience of playing at a place like Texas will be important for Vanderbilt. But they'll come back home for one game, and then they'll hit the road again. That's Mississippi State, a team who I think didn't quite hit those expectations last year. Vanderbilt, that was their opening game in conference play. They went down to Starkville, and they actually won that game. I just remember Bella LaChance being a huge part of that victory, and it was a close one. But now Vanderbilt will get the chance to host them. That was a team that I think underperformed a little bit, and so they'll be looking to have a better year than last year. But that game will be here at home for Vanderbilt.
Yeah, and I think people have to remember, too, that this is a program, Mississippi State, that not that long ago made a national championship appearance and was one Arike Ogunbowale miss away from being national champions. That was just in, I believe, 2018 or 2019. So this is a Mississippi State team where the expectations for that program are so high. And I think, as you mentioned, even without that, just a little bit disappointing from what we saw from them last year. I think a lot of people thought they would be a tournament team. We're kind of in that conversation throughout the year, but weren't able to find their way on the right side of that. It'll be interesting to see how they look this year. And again, another team that, though it is a home game, could come in needing a win, being in that bubble conversation. Going to be interesting to see how they look against them.
So excuse me there. I thought it was one road game, but it's two in a row. A familiar team last year. That was a tough game throughout the entirety of it. Auburn, they'll play the Tigers on the road, and then they'll face the other newcomer to the SEC on the road as well. They'll head to Norman and take on Oklahoma. Auburn is a team that they're always going to play you tough. They're very physical, very scrappy. That doesn't matter if you're playing them at home, on the road, at a neutral site. Auburn is a tough team. And then Oklahoma is what's interesting to me. Picked up a big piece in Reagan Beers from from Oregon State, and that talk about a talented center there.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun to see Vanderbilt match up against her, especially considering what we've seen Sasha Washington be able to do at that 5 spot, really kind of going up against these highly touted centers and holding her own and having some really good games, really holding a lot of these players in check. So to see Reagan Beers now come into this conference and to watch a player again in Sasha Washington that has been one of the more underrated centers, arguably in the SEC, that's going to be a lot of fun to see that game in Norman. And then, as you mentioned, that Auburn game going to be fun too. A very physical team, a scrappy team, as you mentioned. One that I think that, again, maybe isn't getting as much talk, but could very well be in the bubble conversation come February 16th. So that's also a game I think that Shea Ralph and her team know is going to be a tough one. That's one of those teams where Auburn, maybe not a team that a lot of people think of as, again, one of those easy, sharpie them in the bracket type team, but they will play you tough. They typically are always in that conversation. And I think that's one that might be a little bit more low scoring, but is going to be close throughout. And Vanderbilt really going to have to execute and hit all their marks to be able to come out of that one.
Last week of February, Vanderbilt heads home for their last 2 home games. This first one of the 2 is going to have Memorial pretty packed. South Carolina, the reigning undefeated national champion from last year, will play in Nashville. And then right after this, after that game, could be a little bit of a trap, because you have the national champion, you're so focused on them. But Texas A&M, the Aggies also come to Memorial for that very last home game on February the 27th.
Yeah, and I mean, what else is there to say about Dawn Staley? Just an absolute legend. She is making her mark as one of the best coaches in the history of women's basketball. I think at this point, you could put her in just basketball as a whole with the way she has really built this South Carolina program from the ground up. And again, you mentioned that that's a team that's going to have a massive target on their back. Vanderbilt, with one of those last two home games, getting the national champion in your building, such a big opportunity. And this is a Vanderbilt squad that, again, you have to remember they competed really well with South Carolina last year. Game got away from them a little bit in that fourth quarter, but it was within single digits a lot of the time. And with Vanderbilt, again, being a team that has really learned how to win, brings back a lot of experience, brings back a lot of chemistry with each other. South Carolina losing a few pieces, no more Cardosa, a few others as well. Grant is still very, very talented, but I think that's a game where Vanderbilt will be able to compete. Will definitely have a lot of energy in that. And then you mentioned trap game, Texas A&M on senior night as well, a team that played Vanderbilt very, very well in the two meetings last year, two really entertaining games against teams that were right in that bubble last four conversation throughout a lot of February and March. So I think that those are probably the games that intrigue me the most in terms of back-to-back, especially considering how late in the regular season they are.
I'm with you there. I think that little home stint at the very end is I'm gonna be paying very close attention to that. Last game of the year, as far as conference play goes, before the SEC tournament starts, a road game. They'll play at Missouri, team that finished towards the bottom of the SEC last year. Two SEC wins. One of them was at Vanderbilt. That was a trap game for Vanderbilt last year, and the Tigers snuck up on them. But Vanderbilt should be a little bit more well prepared for that, being their last conference game and on the road. But the Tigers, a team that people don't expect them to be one of those better teams in the SEC, but any game on the road in the conference is going to be tough.
Yeah, especially so late in the season too. I mean, at this point, there's going to be so many teams jockeying for position in the SEC and for the SEC tournament. We've talked about it a little bit, Atlanta, but this conference is just so deep from top to bottom, and you could really rank anyone from 1 all the way down to 10 at pretty much any position you'd like. And I wouldn't have much argument with you, really. I mean, there were so many teams that you don't really know. That one game could make a massive difference between Vanderbilt being at the 4 or 3 spot and getting a double bye, or having to play that one extra game and being placed in 7th or 8th. So, that Missouri game, again, a team that did get the best of them in one of those 2 games, one of them being at home, did get the best of them at Missouri, even though it was a tough game for them at certain points. We're able to pull that one out pretty well at the end, but that's going to be an interesting one so late in the season against a team that, like you said, isn't expected to do much, might not have much to lose. That's one of those to where, you're going to have to really kind of hammer it in your team that you're going to have to execute, be fully invested. You can't look too far ahead into that SEC tournament in Greenville the next week.
Right after that, a trip to Greenville is in order. Vanderbilt got a first-round bye in that last year, but knocked out in the second round against Florida. We talked about that earlier. That was a tough one for Vanderbilt to swallow. But now that we've made it through the schedule and talked about it a good bit, is there a home game that you're looking forward to the most? Not necessarily in terms of the teams or players we get to see in person, but what home game do you think stands out to you and is like the staple game that Vanderbilt really wants to get?
I think it's got to be Tennessee, January 19th on that Sunday. A Tennessee team that, as we mentioned, it's been a long time since Vanderbilt has been able to beat them. They've competed well with them. They competed well with them last year. I think that a lot of people felt that with the way that Vanderbilt and Tennessee were both positioned last year, after that first game, Vanderbilt competing so well with them, on a roll coming into that game. A bit of a disappointing performance, I think, on their home floor against their rival in that one. And I feel like when you look at the schedule, the games before that, Georgia, Kentucky, Ole Miss, LSU, 2 at home, 2 on the road. This Vanderbilt team is going to be very, very battle tested. I mean, the last 3 teams before Tennessee could arguably be top 5 in the conference at the end of the year. So to come back at home on a Sunday, I think that there'll be a packed crowd in Memorial Gym that will be very Commodore favored. I think that's one that they really want to have, knowing the stakes behind it, the rivalry behind it, and just knowing that they've been so close to getting past this Tennessee team and a new Tennessee team as well with Kim Caldwell leading things. I think this is one of the best chances they have to beat them. That's going to be the one I'm really looking forward to most.
I think you could argue the fact that a win over Tennessee honestly might mean more than the win over South Carolina if they were able to achieve that, just because Shea Ralph has yet to beat Tennessee. And while a win over South Carolina would obviously be celebrated and huge going forward, you honestly don't have those expectations or standards set. A win over South Carolina is great, but that's not your rival.
Yeah.
When you're playing a team like Tennessee and you've, fought with them for so long and Shea Ralph is yet to get a win, I think that a win against Tennessee would mean more for her and mean more for that program and give them that push going forward and that edge. And so I agree with you there. I think Tennessee is that game that they've got circled on the calendar. But by all means, a win or a competitive game with South Carolina would mean a lot. But beating a rival, it's hard to say that anything's much better than that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, because as you mentioned, there's just that different feeling about when you beat a rival, let alone when it's the only time you could see them and it's on your home floor. Like, and when you get that win, everything just feels a little bit different. Everything feels like you can go right. A win over Tennessee, especially considering it is so early in the season, you have so many games left. I think that could really be a confidence booster for this team, considering they were so close last year, haven't beaten them in the past, tough slate right before then. I think that if Tennessee, if they get that win, that could really be a catapult for them going into that February stretch. That could be really, really tough.
I'm with you there. And hopefully people have stuck around to hear what they want. The SEC poll predictions. I know it's a little bit early, but we're at the point the rosters are set, the schedule's set, so we may as well set our polls. So I'll go ahead and start. I don't want to put you on the spot since it's your first year. Of course, the reigning national champion, South Carolina, is my number one. I'm throwing in the newcomers at 2, Texas Longhorns. It's hard to argue that they're not the second best team, but can't really put anybody above a team that went undefeated last year with one of the best coaches in the country, if not the best, Don Staley. 3, it's hard to argue against Kim Mulkey. I know it was a little bit of a down year, but when you make it as far as you do and you call that a down year, that works for me. So I've got LSU at 3. And then I put the other newcomer to the SEC. I put the Sooners at 4. Reagan Beers just screams like a player that screams, I'm going to tear up the SEC as a center. Just the way that she plays basketball, it's hard to argue against that. She's just captures you anytime you watch, Oklahoma as a team or Oregon State was the case. But I just think that because of Beers coming to the SEC, she's really going to make that Oklahoma program go. 5, Kentucky. I don't think that if you would have told me last year I'd put Kentucky at 5, I'm not sure I would totally believe you. But with Kenny Brooks and Georgia Amore coming to Lexington, it's hard to argue against the fact that they know how to win. 6, I know the Vanderbilt fans are not going to love me saying this, but Tennessee, I know they're under new leadership this year with Kim Caldwell, but given what they've done, they were a basket away of making it to the SEC championship if Camila Cardoso wouldn't have banked in that 3. 7, Vanderbilt. I put them right behind Tennessee. So, and I'm sure you all aren't going to love that, but that's all right. I think that this roster that Vanderbilt and Shea Ralph have constructed is one that they could be very good. They have the ability to play just about every player. And when I look at that, it makes me bump them up probably a spot or 2 higher than I normally would if we were to do that with the same team from last year. But what Shea Ralph has constructed just that really stands out to me on paper. At 8 and 7, I think that those are almost interchangeable. I have Alabama. I think they're not quite as deep, but that's a team that, is just as good as Vanderbilt. And if they played right now, it'd probably be a coin flip. Same with 9, Ole Miss. Those 3 teams right there, 7 through 9, I think are all interchangeable. I just put them there because of Markeisha Davis leaving and getting drafted. And then 10 through 16, I think 10's pretty set for me at Auburn. And after that, I think you can mix up just about anything. I have Florida at 11, Texas A&M at 12, Mississippi State at 13, Arkansas at 14, Georgia at 15, and I'm finishing out with Missouri at 16.
Yeah, and I think that we have a few differences in terms of the order, but I definitely agree with a lot of those. And again, it's just the SEC being such a deep conference that you can really kind of switch and swap whatever you want. And I think you'd have a good argument. So I appreciate you not putting me on the spots as the new guy. It is much appreciated, but I'm with you for my number 1. I have South Carolina. I mean, a Dawn Staley team, reigning national champions, coming off an undefeated season. Yes, did lose some talent from that national championship squad last year, most notably Camila Cardosa. But again, Dawn Staley, she interchanges and develops talent better than arguably anyone in the country. I mean, we're looking at a South Carolina team that's really reached the ranks of a UConn in terms of their ability to really replace and build talent. So hard to not put them at number one, but I have Texas as number two, giving them a really good run for the money. I mean, if it wasn't a Dawn Staley team, I might have Texas at number one just because I do believe in them that much. Number three, I have a little bit different than yours. I have Kentucky at number three. I really like what Kenny Brooks has built. I think he had some really valuable additions in the transfer portal. Again, I think that it could be pretty interchangeable from 3 all the way down to 6 or 7, but I really like what this Kentucky team has. I think they're well balanced. I think that they could be able to steal a win or two against some of these teams that are below them. And it's going to be interesting to see how his program work at Virginia Tech transfers to an SEC level. The ACC, a good conference, but I don't think many people are going to argue the SEC probably the best conference in the country. So going to be interesting there. Number 4, I have Oklahoma. Just looking what they did last season, winning that Big 12 championship, finding their way to a pretty good run. I think that they adjust well to the SEC, especially with their play style. I have them at number 4, just a little bit over LSU at number 5. I'll be honest, it feels wrong having Kim Mulkey this low. I mean, in top 5 in the SEC, that is a really good finish. But I just think that with some of those losses, with no more Angel Reese, losing Haley Van Lith to the transfer portal, obviously you still have Flau'jae Johnson. You still have a lot of the pieces from last year's team in terms of the depth. But I just feel like with some of those additions of Texas and Oklahoma, where LSU would typically have finished around 3rd or 2nd, I think that slots them down to more of a 4 or 5 finish. Number 6, call me a homer if you want to. I have Vanderbilt. I think that they just get the edge over Tennessee, who I have at 7. I love the depth of Vanderbilt. I love the experience. I think that this is probably the deepest team that the Commodores have had in easily the last 10 years. And some of those games that they just lost last year, I think that's a little bit different this year. They're used to being in this position. They're used to being a team that can be in the games at the end of it when it comes to those high-end SEC teams. And I think that having that extra year, knowing that this is where they're supposed to be. Last year, they caught a lot of teams off guard, but I think that they know who they are now. They know how to win. They have that year of experience, and they come off of a season where they won a tournament game. That means something. That adds that confidence. I'm giving them that extra little bit of jump being at 6, and then Tennessee right behind them at 7. I like Tennessee. I think they have a good roster, but I feel like at the beginning of the year, it may take them a little bit of time to really get that Kim Caldwell system underway. You mentioned the 2 losses of Rakia Jackson, Tamari Key. I think that's going to affect them a little bit in SEC play. That's why I give Vanderbilt a little bit of edge of them in my personal rankings. You mentioned it, 8 all the way through 10 or 12. You could probably interchange any of them. I have Alabama at 8, Ole Miss at 9, and Texas A&M to round out my top 10. You could argue A&M maybe a little bit higher than some, but I think that A&M, considering that they have had that experience of having to kind of play down the stretch and really needing as many wins as they can, will probably help them come February and March, just because they do return a pretty solid team. And again, they're going to have to beat some of those teams above them, like Vanderbilt, like Tennessee, maybe get a marquee win against a team like LSU or Oklahoma. But I think that they're a team that could sneak up on some people. We mentioned that's a potential trap game at the end of the year. So A&M, a team I believe in. At 10, Ole Miss, Coach Yo and that team, always so fun to watch. I like them a lot. I think they could easily be higher any other year. But again, such a deep conference. I had them at 9, and Alabama at 8, a team that could very well be ranked in the top 25 at the beginning of the year. So maybe a little bit undersized, maybe a team that I feel has been a little bit overhyped at the beginning of the year, but I still do like this Alabama team and have them in the top 10. 11 through 16, again, very interchangeable. Auburn at 11, Mississippi State at 12, Arkansas at 13, Florida at 14, Georgia at 15, and Missouri at 16. And I mean, once again, you could pretty much switch and swap whenever you want there. I probably will have a different opinion on it next week, just because this conference is so wide open. And even though there are teams that are in that bottom 6, I think that the top 12 in this conference make the tournament, or at least have a really good shot to. So I think that all the way from South Carolina down to Auburn makes that field of 68. And again, Elena, just so much with this conference, so much talent, so much depth, that really any of this we could look back on in a few months and be like, man, how was I so wrong about this?
Yeah, I will look back at it and be like, that was not right at all. But honestly, on paper, it looks right now. I think to preface too, I agree with you on a lot of things. I think that Tennessee just above Vanderbilt for me. I think I could switch that if Vanderbilt would have won one of those games last year. I think that's the only reason that I've got them just right below. But that's going to be interesting with a new coach. And so honestly, that system that she's playing is going to be intriguing to me over at Tennessee, just to see where they fall after that in the SEC, because that is something that it's either going to work really well or not at all, and she's going to have to adjust. But new coach Kim Caldwell, just getting ready for her first season with the Lady Vols, and so that Vanderbilt game at home makes it super intriguing for me. I'm still a little bit bitter that wasn't the game that Vanderbilt plays the same team twice. It was Tennessee. Not sure how the SEC missed out on that one. I would love to see that twice. A trip to Knoxville is always fun. But do you have any last thoughts for this schedule?
Raises stakes a little bit, I think, with it being that one game. But honestly, I think my final thoughts are just how spoiled are we with this team and with this conference? I mean, some of the games that we're going to get throughout the entire season are going to be so fun. And again, I think that Shea Ralph and this team, they kind of know what they're looking at. They knew this conference was going to be tough. It was tough last year, going to be even tougher this year. But again, just with the growth of this program, all of the returning production that they have, the experience that this team has, I feel like that they'll be up for that challenge. And again, that's why I gave them just that little bit of edge over Tennessee. I definitely can see your argument with it. Tennessee, very good team. I just feel like with some of those big departures with Jackson and Key, the new system early in the year might take a little bit of time to adjust. But overall, I feel like Vanderbilt has to feel pretty good about things. A pretty balanced schedule overall. Some tough games for sure. That Texas A&M one, I think, is the one that probably scares me the most late in the season. I believe in that A&M team a lot. I think they could be a tournament team at the end of the year. But overall, some exciting opportunities. I think that if they win 11 or 12 conference games, they will be in a very good position to be in a spot for a double bye.
I mean, spoiled is the perfect word, Brandon. We couldn't be watching better basketball at the right time. I mean, the women's basketball as a game, it just as a whole is growing tremendously. So the fact that we get to watch some of the best in the best conference night in and night out is just we're spoiled. That's the best word for it. But we appreciate you guys listening to our content. For Brandon, I'm Elena. We appreciate you guys supporting us. And again, we are looking for a sponsor for all of the women's basketball content that we provide for this upcoming season. And we're looking forward to doing that. So if you are interested, please feel free to reach out and also let us know what you guys think as far as your conference predictions. But for now, that's all we've got. But I'm sure we'll be able to talk about some more Vandy basketball soon. Thank you guys for listening.